Hello, welcome listeners to another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love, hosted by Richard Osler. About 6 months ago, I was on a long drive across the country, which is rare for me, and I thought I better start listening to podcasts, which is something I don't usually do, and I started to listen to In and Out with Jim and Ian, and a frequent guest on that podcast is our guest on today's podcast, Gregory Prince. Welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thank you. I have to make one slight correction. In and Out is a hamburger store. Inside Out is the podcast.
I'm glad you Inside Out. We love In and Out, but Inside Out certainly has better verbal content. So that's a good. I don't want to get sideways with Jim and Ian by mispronouncing their podcast. And that's a terrific podcast. Check that out. Greg has been somebody that's been an ally in the LGBTQ space longer than I have. And after listening to a few of those episodes, I felt I need to read Greg's book. It's called Gay Rights in the Mormon Church, Intended Actions, Unintended Consequences. It was written in 2019, and it's a terrific book. I finished the book. Most of the guests that come on the podcast, I don't read their books. I just don't have time. But then I reached out to Greg and just thought, I owe it to you, our listeners, if you're not aware of Greg Prince and his book, since we are 90% LGBTQ on this platform, to connect you with Greg and his book. So Greg lives in Maryland. Tell us a little bit about you for somebody that doesn't know you, your career background, and just introduce yourself to our guests.
A lot of my career has been accidental, including my writing. I grew up in Southern California in an extended family of dentists. That was always going to be my career path. I did go to dental school at UCLA, but midway through had my head turned by pathology. After doing a year residency in pathology during dental school, and after finishing dental school, I went back for graduate work in pathology, and that took me to Maryland to the National Institutes of Health in 1975. For what was to have been a 2-year fellowship. And here I am still in Maryland 51 years later and greatly enjoying this area of the country in spite of the political circus that always goes on.
Tell us about we're going to talk about this book in particular, but you've written multiple books in the LDS space. Introduce those for our listeners.
I had no aspirations to write anything. My least favorite subjects in high school and college were English and history. But by one of many apparent flukes, or maybe not flukes, in my life, when we moved to Maryland, we purchased a home in a Maryland suburb named Gaithersburg, not knowing that 1 year prior to that, Lester Bush and his family had moved into the same ward. I'd heard of him. His landmark article on blacks and priesthood had been published in 1973. We met only 3 or 4 weeks thereafter because as new members of the ward, we were invited to speak in sacrament meeting. Lester came up after the meeting, introduced himself, and that began a friendship where I considered him my closest friend for 48 years until he died. It was also at that time that Dialogue, which is the oldest and most prestigious independent journal of Mormon studies, moved from the UCLA campus to suburban Virginia, which is just across the river from where we live. Lester became the associate editor. And he gently started pulling me into the Dialogue orbit. I would just go over occasionally for their evening work meetings. Eventually, they asked me to be the book review editor. But at the same time that was happening, I was called to be an elders quorum president. I had never had a priesthood job. All my callings prior to that had been in the auxiliary organizations. And I was elders quorum president for 4 years. That's cruel and unusual punishment. Anybody who's been in that position will understand that immediately. The only person who never gave me any sympathy was Bill Marriott, to whom I reported in the stake presidency, he said, big deal. I was elders quorum president for 8 years. But in the course of doing that work, I found that I had a lot of questions about priesthood, getting down to the very essence. All right, what is this? Is it really what we say it is? And if so, how does one function as a holder of the priesthood? I had started collecting Mormon books while I was still at UCLA, and it became a passion. Eventually, and it's been about 4 or 5 years now, I donated my library to the University of Virginia, which has a Mormon studies program, the only one in the eastern half of the United States. It had about 11,000 volumes when I donated. When I was Elders Quorum president, it probably had 2,000 or 3,000 volumes. And I had read everything I could get my hands on the subject of priesthood, and none of it answered any of my questions. So it took a while, but eventually, with some encouragement from Lester Bush, I started to do the research, initially looking at the whole span of the church history, but then pretty quickly focusing on the Joseph Smith period, because that's where the interesting stuff happened. That's where most of the evolution occurred. And with some hope that maybe the real historians would get me off the hook and write the book that I thought needed to be written, I found that that hope was not going to be realized, and didn't know at that time that the history department of the church was under fire from two senior apostles who didn't like the New Mormon history. In 1972, Leonard Arrington had been called to be the church historian, the only time in the history of the church where somebody with professional doctorate level credentials was called to that position. And these two apostles, Ezra Benson and Mark Peterson, didn't like that, and eventually succeeded in dismantling the history division and sending Leonard packing to BYU. That's why they hadn't touched priesthood. They were told there are certain subjects you will not research and write on. And one of them was priesthood, particularly the early years, priesthood restoration. So after grousing about it for a while, I finally started to do something about it. Spent about 7 years doing the research and roughly a year in writing what became my first book, which was called Power from on High, The Development of Mormon Priesthood, all focused on the Joseph Smith years. That led directly to the next book, because as I was working on it, a new mission president came into town. I thought I had a pretty good handle on what mission presidents looked like. This one didn't. He was very open-minded, and when I gave a priesthood lesson on the 1978 revelation and was talking about the role that Lester Bush had had in that, he approached me, never having met me prior to that, and I thought, uh-oh, he's going to lay into me for bringing up a controversial subject. He said, that was fascinating. Can you arrange a meeting with Lester Bush? So that was the beginning of an ongoing friendship. We had Bob and Janet Wright over for dinner a couple times, and in one of those evenings, I gave him a couple chapters of the priesthood book, which was just in manuscript then. Next time he came back, he said, "Are you familiar with the name of Claire Middlemas?" Well, I know she was President McKay's secretary. Well, she was my aunt. She was then deceased, and he said she left all of her papers to me with the hope that I would write a biography of President McKay.
Wow.
All her papers included 40,000 pages of typescript of the McKay diaries, which she had kept in the 35 years she had been his secretary, and thousands of pages of scrapbooks that she and other secretaries had compiled. So that was the genesis of the McKay biography. That took 10 years. The diaries were foundational for it, but that was when I started down a road that I've never left of interviewing people, because I realized that there were still a lot of people around who'd known President McKay well enough to have something to say about him. And Bob and I did our homework. We eventually did 200 oral histories of people who were either family or friends or professional associates who had something to say about him. And that became the other crucial part. The diaries gave a two-dimensional biography. The interviews put a third dimension to it, the subjective reminiscences that put things into historical context. The very first interview I did was Sterling McMurrin, who turned out to be one of the most important ones that I ever did and one of the most remarkable people that I've ever met. The McKay book came out in the spring of 2005. In the fall of 2005, I gave a lecture in Logan, and it was on President McKay. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and introduced herself. She says, "I'm Susan Arrington Madsen. Can we have breakfast tomorrow?" Well, she was the daughter of Leonard Arrington.
Wow.
And she said at breakfast, "My brothers and I have read your biography of President McKay. Would you do Dad's biography?"
Wow.
So I go through that sequence because one led to the second, led to the third. The Arrington biography took about 9 years, but during that, I became sensitized for the first time to LGBTQ issues within the church. My sister's lesbian, but that had never been an issue. So I didn't have my consciousness raised as to what the larger LGBTQ universe was all about. In the aftermath of the 2008 election, which elected Barack Obama as president, it also led to the passage of Proposition 8 in California, which embedded in the California state constitution a law that forbade same-sex marriage. Even that, because it was across the continent from me, had not been a major issue for me. I was saddened that it passed. But a few days after that, I received a phone call from Helen Whitney. You probably are not familiar with her name, but in 2007, a 4-hour documentary called The Mormons that she had produced was broadcast nationally on PBS. I had become involved with that because one of the people associated with the University of Utah Press who had known her had sent her the galleys of that biography. She called me and said, "I need to talk to you because I need to get a handle on 20th century Mormonism. And I think your biography is key to doing that." We spent probably a couple hundred hours over the next 2 years with me mostly in the background, just advising her on 20th century issues. She called me just days after the election and said, "I need your help." One of my closest friends is Andrew Solomon. He writes for The New Yorker. He is a nationally renowned writer, won a National Book Award for a book on depression, is a gay activist. She said he has turned on me because of Prop 8, saying, "Helen, how could you have said anything nice in your documentary about this evil church that was pivotal in passing Proposition 8? So that's a long story, but that's how one led to another, and finally how I became sensitized to the LGBTQ issues within the church. Initially, that book was going to be on the church's role in Prop 8, period. As I got into Prop 8, I realized quickly Prop 8 was just a reiteration of Prop 22 8 years earlier. The exact wording, Prop 22, which passed in California by a large margin, it was nearly a 2/3 margin, embedded in state law the prohibition of same-sex marriage. But when the courts ruled that that was unconstitutional per the California state constitution, then the anti-marriage equality forces came right back with an initiative that used the exact language, but this time embedding it as an amendment to the state constitution, which meant by definition, if it passed, it could not be ruled unconstitutional, except that it later was in a federal court because they said, no, this is in opposition to the US Constitution. But then I realized as well that it wasn't just a question of what happened in California. The marriage equality battle really started in Hawaii in the early 1990s. That was the first time in the history of the country where a court challenge to the existing law forbidding same-sex marriage looked like it had a chance of passing. And so that's when the LDS Church jumped in. They did it using a very low-profile approach. They created, in fact, a front organization that, to look at it, would have given you no idea that the church was even involved in it. And then once I started to realize the importance of marriage equality, I thought you can't divorce this from just the overall universe of LGBTQ issues. That's why that book takes on everything. It starts in the late 1960s because that's when the issue became an issue both within the church and within American society. There was really a pivotal point in 1969. It was the Stonewall Inn riots in New York City. Gays had certainly been apparent in American society for decades, but they were mostly closeted, in part because I think of their own fear that the society was hostile to them. But the Stonewall Inn riots were a no more event. That those riots really represented the permanent coming out of gay issues into the public square in the United States. 1 year prior to that, 1968, was when Spencer Kimball published his book, The Miracle of Forgiveness. The 6th chapter of that is one of the most homophobic and harmful things ever published by a church authority. So that just sets the stage, Richard, for how did I get into this and when did I get into this? And eventually, because of my relationship with Andrew Solomon and apparently serendipitous events that put me in contact with other national figures in the LGBTQ movement, I decided to take that book on and get it out as quickly as I could. I think that was only about a 5 or 6 year project. My other books average 9 years.
It's fascinating, Greg, to hear that history. I'm reading the David O. McKay book, listeners, and enjoying that, and want to go back to these other 2 books. So that's 4 books, if I got it right. You just talked about.
Yep.
Listeners, I'm just going to. We haven't planned exactly how this is going to go, but I'm not worried about that. There's 31 chapters, and some chapters, like Greg has just talked about, took me through the legal history, starting with Hawaii. And other chapters took me into the sort of how the church is handling this topic from a pastoral perspective. Is this a choice? Is this not a choice? Chapter 3 is called The Cure 1.0. Chapter 10 is called The Cure 2.0. So, and there's other strands in there. There's personal stories in there. So for me, just trying to understand this space and better support people, it was very eye-opening to understand just where the church has been and where we're going and what's possible in the future. One of the things, just as a side note, that I'm not sure I've ever told you, but you spoke at Affirmation in San Francisco a long time ago. I was an early ally sitting on the back row, And you said something that I have repeated on this podcast a lot of times is when the church said this wasn't a choice and you can't unchoose it, the other shoe hasn't dropped. It's an unsustainable position. And then you said, I don't know how the shoe's going to drop. I don't know what will happen. And I don't know if you said that in multiple locations. Is this just, I'd love to hear more about your thought on that or anywhere you want to talk about.
I think that's a good place to jump in, Richard. Probably the most important foundational point on this subject is that not only the church, but society in general, including the medical profession, for forever had made the assumption that this was just a choice. You chose to be gay. It never dawned on them to ask straight people, when did you choose to be straight? But it became the paradigm. I just call it the behavioral paradigm. That this is a behavior that you chose to adopt, you can choose not to adopt it, and then we will accept you and life will go on. It was pretty much that cut and dried. The only problem is it didn't work. And it never worked. But the earliest loud voice within the church was Spencer Kimball. In large part, that was because I think back in the late 40s, he had been assigned by President McKay to handle these difficult church judicial cases involving sexual transgression. And among those was homosexual. That became almost a steady diet for him. Later, Mark Peterson was added to that group, and later they added more staffers because the amount of work was just overwhelming. These were cases that would come to them from bishops and stake presidents. Some of them would be appeals to the first presidency of judicial action taken at the local level. But that was to borrow the metaphor, that was the water they were swimming in for years. And it exposed Spencer Kimball, I think, to the darker side of LGBTQ. For him, there was no lighter side. And his own conditioning led him to conclude not only that this was a chosen behavior, and he said and wrote on occasion, until your knees have been bloodied by praying to have this reversed, you're not doing the right thing. His assumption was it's a chosen behavior. If you don't change it, then you are the sinner. And if we determine that you are gay, regardless of your actions, we will excommunicate you. It was that draconian. Up until 1969, the church's sole statement in any official publication regarding homosexuality was in the General Handbook of Instructions. For your listeners who don't recognize that, this is the LDS equivalent of Catholic canon law. It's the rule book for church administration. In 1968, for the very first time, it mentioned the H word, except the H word then was homo-sexual acts, period. It did not specify what those acts were. It gave no explanation. It merely put that on a list of transgressions that may result in church judicial action, period. So it had not been an issue prior to 1968 that had a high enough profile that there was any official policy on it. What Kimball did when he became president 5 years after that general handbook came out was to go totally hardline on it. Not only to say, if you are gay, we will excommunicate you, but it led to draconian practices, probably the most extreme of which was BYU's security. Now, this is a police force on the BYU campus, but at that time period, they were given by the Utah legislature police authority anywhere in the state of Utah, not just on the BYU campus. And the paranoia was such that they used to stake out gay bars in Salt Lake, take down license plate numbers, find students who were frequenting those bars, bring them in and threaten them with excommunication and expulsion from the university, maybe to be modified if they ratted out on some of their gay fellow students. It was that bad. It was the darkest of ages. So that was really where we got into a very deep and dark rut that we're still not out of completely. But the important thing is during all those years, it was the behavioral paradigm that was driving this thing. This is just a bad behavior. You chose it. We can help you unchoose it. And that was the chapter you referred to of the Cure 1.0. The only problem is it didn't work. I've talked to a lot of men because it's mostly male homosexuals that the church had focused on and still does. They tend to leave the lesbians more or less alone. But I've talked to a lot of them who were missionaries who went on their missions with the assumption that the Lord would bless them for their efforts by turning them straight. And it never happened. For many, that was such a letdown that they left the church after they came home from the mission. For others, it just remained this huge dilemma that they were never able to resolve, and they lived in constant turmoil, in some instances taking their own lives because they simply could not navigate it.
Just super helpful to go back in this history, because I connected in the history listeners when we were pretty much saying this was not a choice and this is who you are, but it's been eye-opening and really painful, and some of our guests have been the very people Greg's talked about. As I'm thinking how to frame these multiple podcasts, let's keep focused on the church's pastoral, I don't know if that's the right word, just how we taught about this internally, how we supported people, and keep the legal stuff, starting with Hawaii, as a separate podcast. How does that sound?
That sounds fine.
Okay. So keep we're now keep sharing just this, where we are supporting gay people in the church.
Well, if you look at the pastoral issue, as I think back on it, even though there was that brief notation in the General Handbook of Instructions in 1968, the issue for most church members, including me, was still invisible. I never heard a talk, either in ward or stake or general meetings, general conference, that even addressed the issue, even named the issue, much less went into any detail. There was never a lesson in any priesthood or Sunday school manual that even brought up the issue. So the issue, in a sense, was closeted within the church. The first person I was aware of in the church who was gay was somebody who I had been in the UCLA ward with when I was in graduate school. I got married in 1973, and we moved to Maryland 2 years later. We moved out of UCLA ward, so I was not at the famous testimony meeting when he came out publicly.
Wow.
From the pulpit. That was the very first time I was even aware that a church member had acknowledged that he was gay. After we moved to Maryland, we, meaning my wife and I, were home teachers to Larry Bush. Larry was the younger brother of Lester Bush, lived in the same ward. And we'd been home teaching him for a few months, went over for a visit one evening, and he came out to us.
Wow.
So that was the first time that I had met anybody in the church who was openly gay. Now that's 1975. So I think it underscores how closeted this issue was. And even then, it was not a front burner issue. It was at about that same time, I think around 77, that Affirmation began as an underground organization at BYU. It was a loose affiliation of gay men who were BYU students who sought support, but always under the threat of expulsion and excommunication if they were ever found out. So that tells you how long it took for this to start to move into a more public posture. Kimball, I think, forced the issue because of that book and because of the thirst that so many church leaders had for trying to rid the church of this scourge. And that's how they viewed it. They needed to cleanse the church. That's not a very pastoral posture, but that was the reality.
Talk about, it's really sobering, listeners, to hear that. I'm thinking of Tom Christofferson, the younger brother of President Christofferson. And you may fact check me on this, but my understanding is, when he knew he was gay and he knew coming out would, and I think he just self-resigned from the church. He wasn't acting on it at the time. He just knew the church's position. You couldn't be gay in the church and be in good standing. And I think that's in the 70s. Do you know the details of Tom's story there? That's my general understanding, just a personal story from the time you're describing.
I'm trying to remember when I was asked to be on the board of Affirmation. It was probably 2010, 2011. It was after I met Andrew Solomon. And the first board meeting I attended, Tom Christofferson was there also as a board member. He'd been on a little bit longer than I had. My immediate impression of Tom was, if you put him in the same room with his older brother Todd and asked somebody which one's the apostle, they likely would pick Tom. Just an enormously impressive, though understated, human being. Very humble, and yet there is an aura about him that I feel every time I'm in his presence. He had gone on his mission assuming the behavioral paradigm to be true, meaning, okay, if I go on the mission, if I'm a super devout missionary, then the Lord will help me choose the other pathway in life. And when he came home and found out that nothing had changed, he was devastated. Now, you, Richard, because of the people you interact with, that's an old hat story. You probably can't count the number of times you've heard that from a returned missionary. But here was a man as devout as I could have imagined, who did all the right things, checked all the right boxes, and nothing changed. That was still at the time when the behavioral paradigm ruled the roost within Mormonism and, frankly, within most of American society and most American religious traditions. Earlier, it had been even worse, that homosexuality was considered a disease. In the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, it was labeled as a disease. We finally got past that one, but we didn't get past the behavioral paradigm, and we're still not really past it, because even though the church has acknowledged, all right, this isn't a choice, but if you act that way that you're not choosing to be in the first place, we're going to whack you. That's where we are.
True.
That's what led to that statement in San Francisco that we're trying to do a balancing act that is not sustainable. If it is not a choice, if that's the way we come minted, if I can put it in that term, then why are we punishing people for being what they are? It's a good question, and I haven't heard a good answer.
Talk about, I love the way you talk about Tom. And just that's a beautiful description of Tom. For anybody who doesn't know Tom, and Tom represents a lot of our LGBTQ friends that are just wonderful and good and spiritual and kind, of all the same like Christ-like attributes as anybody else. And that was a beautiful just couple minutes on humanizing Tom for our listeners. This is a little bit of a sidetrack, but it's still kind of under the behavioral model. And I'm not sure I can pronounce this, but I think you were the one that first brought this up, epigenetics, or what the term "what goes on in the womb." And
Yeah,
since you're a scientist, this is in your alley too.
okay. And I didn't get into this in that book. I get into it deeply in an ongoing book that we hope will be out next year, where I did a lengthy chapter on the biology.
Good.
The word is epigenetics.
There you go.
Epi is what's the word for it? A prefix that denotes above. So it's above genetics. Let me backtrack a bit. Genetics is the DNA. Think of it as a very long string of beads, and that's the blueprint of life. Those genes will determine what proteins are made and how they are configured and expressed, and that makes you what you are. Epigenetics is a variety of factors, forces that control how those genes are expressed. So the genome, the DNA, is just the potential. Changing that potential into action is largely controlled by this array of forces that we call epigenetics. There are, without getting too deeply into the weeds, there are 4 classes of things, biological things, that are really determinative in sexual orientation and gender identity. Number 1 is genetics, the DNA. Second is epigenetics. Third is hormones that interact with the developing fetus in the womb. And then for men only, there is immunology, and that has to do with what's called the birth order effect. We can talk about that in a subsequent broadcast because it deserves a little bit more time than 30 seconds. So those are the 4 things that, working sometimes in harmony with each other, sometimes in contradiction with each other, are determinative of what that individual is after birth. And it's important to realize that there are multiple factors and that they can operate at greater or lesser intensity from one person to another, even within the womb of one twin versus another. If non-heterosexuality, and I'll use that term because it's all-encompassing, the LGBTQIAP plus says there are this many domains, but a lot of those are not homosexual. So if we talk about homosexuality, that is too exclusive a term. So non-heterosexuality is, I think, a generally accepted term. Think of that as not linear, but as multidimensional. Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s wrote 2 books, Sexuality in the Human Male and Sexuality in the Human Female, that became benchmark references in medicine. He did the field something of a service by establishing a spectrum and putting numbers on it, and said, if you're a 0, you're totally heterosexual. If you're a 6, you're totally homosexual. If you're 3, you're bisexual. Well, that turned out not only to be inaccurate, but I think harmful because it established linearity in people's minds, and this is not linear. Think of a multidimensional array, and in fact, any two people may not fit in a given array with each other. It can be that individualistic. So if genetics were the only issue that determined one's sexual orientation or gender identity, then identical twins would be 100% identical, meaning if one were straight, the other would be straight. If one were gay, the other would be straight. No exceptions. Turns out that it's only about a 50 to 60% coincidence, which means there's something besides the DNA that is shaping that individual to become, in one instance, gay. We don't know a lot of the details yet, but we do know that epigenetic factors in those cases are determinative. That even though the DNA blueprint is identical in those two twins, the way that epigenetics works within the womb can be different enough that those two come out different. One's gay, one's straight. That's a long response to your epigenetics question, but there it is.
And I love you talked about identical twins. Now, some could go back to the behavior model and say, well, one identical twin chose to be gay and one didn't. You hear people doing that with that sort of science?
They try, but it doesn't stick.
Good.
And in fact, there has not been any explanation built on the behavioral paradigm that holds water. There are some cultures, mostly Asian, where male homosexuality, let me rephrase that, where male homosexual sex acts are part of the rite of passage. And yet those boys are most likely to become straight men. If men are incarcerated, so there are no women, then the amount of homosexual activity goes up. But as soon as they get back into civilian life, it goes back to where it was. And there's on and on and on these types of things where you can put them into a cultural setting that either allows or even encourages homosexual activity, but doesn't change their orientation. It just changes their behavior temporarily until they get back into a different setting, and then they revert to what they were. So none of those things has held up, even though the voices proclaiming that that was the gospel have been loud for a long time.
And one of the things I've read that you've taught me is just this. I think of sexual orientation, and I don't really go to the brain, but you've talked about how this is hardwired in the brain. It's not manifested till puberty. Maybe you feel the same way about gender identity, but
Yeah.
I didn't think of the brain when I think of sexual orientation, and you've helped me to realize that's where it all starts, and that's where it's hardwired as
The
part
brain
of this.
is the organ of sex. It's not the genitalia.
Yeah, you say that better than I do. If you share more on that, if you'd like to.
It's just the fact that you can look at, to use the term, the plumbing, and it doesn't necessarily match what the presentation of that individual is. Why is that the case? They've got the same anatomy as others of their sex, and yet they've got a different sexual orientation. And the answer is that's imprinted during prenatal development, and it's permanent and it's not changeable. It doesn't matter how much time you spend on your knees praying. It doesn't matter how many sessions of electroshock you have to try to reorient you. It doesn't work. The only thing that it does is to screw you up.
Agreed.
and sometimes permanently. And that's why the American Psychological Association, going back to 2009, came out with a whole book on the subject and said the the reparative therapy is not just bogus, it's harmful. That on the one hand, it does not change sexual orientation, and on the other hand, in many instances, it causes irreparable damage. So stop it. And yet we still have states throughout the nation and judicial decisions recently that still allow for practitioners to push reparative therapy.
And really powerful segment, listeners. When you think about those cultures you talked about where homosexuality was a rite of passage, you could look at that as like conversion therapy for gay people. That's still, those steep people were still straight, most of them.
Yeah.
And that experience didn't change their sexual orientation, to your point. So having a gay person walk through conversion therapy, even with the hope that they're straight and on their knees, to your point, and doing all the things that President Kimball invited them to do, and they're still gay, it's crushing and can lead to suicide. I love that one of the things I wrote down as you're talking, Greg, is science is our friend. Listeners, I sort of think science is a window on how God uses his priesthood to create things. And I've always felt, after a period of time of listening to so many of my queer friends, that most of them come to the point where they believe they're created as intended. It's not a mistake. They're a sexual minority or a gender minority, but they look in the mirror believing this is who they're supposed to be. And that's very different than the period of time you're talking about. Talk, Greg, when this started to change in the church, just where did this start to change a little bit? Who are the voices to start to talk about this may not be a choice, and we don't sort of unteach things, so we've never really stepped forward and had a list of things we used to teach and now we don't teach anymore, which I wish we did, because a lot of people are left with the behavior model. So talk more about that.
It's hard to track the genesis of how this message began to penetrate the hierarchy. And who were those voices? You probably know Rich Ferry,
The name,
who's a psychiatrist.
just the name.
He was an advisor to the missionary committee for, I think, like 30 years. And gradually, as a psychiatrist, he became more and more aware that the biological paradigm ruled the day, not the behavioral paradigm. And I think that he was probably one voice that some within the hierarchy took seriously, but certainly was not the only one. You also had instances where family members of general authorities, particularly in the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12, would come out as gay, and that could sensitize in either direction.
Mm.
In the case of the Christofferson family, I don't think there was ever a point where that family was anything less than fully supportive of Tom and fully accepting not only of him, but of his companion, Clark. In fact, Tom said at one point that the family had said, when they were living together, they said, if you and Clark ever split up, we're keeping Clark. They were that supportive. But other instances, and you know some of the names, we don't need to go into the names, had just the opposite, that they rejected those family members, be they children or grandchildren or whatever. Were some who I think earlier on started to get it, though I don't know what their pathway was towards getting it. I knew Jeff Holland for over 50 years. And in spite of that unfortunate Muscat speech that I think he was commanded to give and regretted, he was much more understanding of this field than most of his colleagues. I interviewed one gentleman who had been a long-time fixture in Salt Lake City. His daughter had married a gay man, and they were struggling to make the mixed orientation marriage work. They met with Jeff, who was very supportive. And in that meeting, he said, "My colleagues," meaning in the quorum, "have come a long way on this issue, but they have miles and miles yet to go." And I don't know if the number of miles has lessened, but it's still miles to go. And you can see that in some of the messages that keep coming out. Is that an
Yeah,
adequate response
it's
to
a
your
great
question?
response. And um, articulate, I know there's a statement on the church website. I just love to articulate for anybody who's wondering, what is the church's official position? Best I understand, the official position is we have no position on the cause of someone being gay or lesbian. We don't point to anything, and we're not, and Elder Holland made a comment that's on the church website is, a change in sexual orientation shouldn't be demanded or expected by parents or leaders. That's pretty close to what his quote is. So that's the best framing of I can tell. Neither of these comments appear in general conference.
No, no, and there has never been a comprehensive treatise that really deals with the issue in the way that you and I would like to have it dealt with. President Oakes, it goes back a couple decades, I think, when he and Lance Wickman had that interview that appeared on the church website. I think that was the first time that somebody at the level of the Q15 had acknowledged that biology was a factor. Now, he didn't say it was determinative, but just by saying that much, he opened a door that prior to that had been shut. So it allowed at least the contemplation of a biological paradigm. But it didn't, in his mind, permit any type of homosexual activity. So that created that one shoe dropping, other shoe not dropping dilemma that we still have. If it really is biology, then we need to rethink everything that we built on the other foundation because it's crumbling. Now, there are some areas, the I of LGBTQIA is intersex. When I was writing the gay rights book, and then 7 years later, when I was researching the chapter on biology that will be in the anthology that several of us are preparing now, I could not find a single reference in any church publication or any public address by a church figure that even mentioned intersex. And the reason's pretty obvious. By definition, it is biology, period. And I think that's why they will not go there. They will not touch it. Because as soon as they do, then their other paradigm caves in. So we still have a long way to go in the sense that, in my mind, it's a done deal that this is all biological. But it is made more difficult to understand because of this vast array of combinations of sexual orientation and gender identity. Think of those as two axes on a graph, and then you've got multiple possibilities. The the overall presentations are endless, and each individual is likely to have different biological underpinnings of where they are. So to try to say, here's the answer, doesn't work. Now, that was attempted back, I think, in the 90s when molecular biology was becoming a mature science. Dean Hamer at NIH was leading the hunt for the gay gene, the assumption being that that would explain everything. Well, eventually, he had to acknowledge that There isn't a gay gene. There are some genes that are more prevalent and some clusters of genes that would be more likely to be expressed in somebody who's gay than somebody who's straight. But that doesn't get us all the way towards a final answer because there is no simple answer to it. I live in a world of autism. Our youngest son, rather, who's 36, is severely autistic. Autism is talked about as being a spectrum. It isn't, it's an array. And there is no single autism gene as well. I think there are a lot of parallels if you're studying the biology of those two things. Not that they're the same thing, it's just that the complexity within each makes it difficult for the biologist to win the day in the face of the behaviorist because we don't have a single answer we can point to. We have to say, this is really complex, but it's really biological.
So fascinating. You have chapter 12 of the book, listeners, is Dallin Oaks in the interview with Lance Wickman. I'm aware of that interview, and thanks for the added context. One of your gifts to our community is you kind of start at the 40,000 foot level and give a lot of context, Greg, and then you kind of go in, and I've loved listening to you on with Jim Bennett and Ian Wilkes for the same reason. You're just great there. I'm thinking, we're coming to the hour mark, and we're going to do more podcasts with Greg, and for sure we're going to get into the legal side. One of the things in that interview, and you may have more context here, is I've heard at times, and may have been in that very interview, where church leaders have said everybody's going to be straight in the resurrection. And I heard that and was comfortable with that, thought all my gay and lesbian friends would love to hear that. And then I started, like you did, started listening to gay and lesbian people, and that was crushing for most of them and increased suicidal ideation and actual suicides because they thought, well, okay, this is my final ace in the hole. This is the final thing I can do to be straight. I've tried everything else. The missions you've talked about, all the things that President Kimball talked about, and the shame and the self-loathing and just, okay, I know how to do this now. I will die by suicide and be straight in the next life. And the church hasn't said anything on that subject for a long time, and I don't know why. I don't know if they've recognized we don't know enough about the next life to say that, or they recognize it can lead to especially younger queer people dying by suicide. And then I listened to, as I've done so many interviews like you have, and I started to ask my queer friends, if there's a red button in the middle of the table, would you push it to be straight? And some of my friends that are in a mixed orientation marriage said, yeah, I kind of like to be straight. But the majority say, no, this is like an innate attribute of me. It's part of my spiritual gifts. The resurrection is the perfection of my best self, and this should not be carved out. And that's been really interesting to hear. Instead of me sort of thinking what's best for my queer friends, listening to my queer friends process that space. Thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, let me respond with two thoughts on it. Referring again to the autism world, many people who have, we now say lower support needs rather than saying high functioning, low functioning. It's a kinder label for it. Will say, hey, don't try to fix me. I don't want to be fixed. I am what I am. I'm okay with that. I don't want to be anything else. The other observation is that Bill Bradshaw, a wonderful man who died about a month ago, was a BYU professor all his career and who got into the biology of homosexuality because he had a son who came out. He was on the doctorate committee for John Dehlin. John did his doctorate work at Utah State University. Bill was at BYU, but he was on the committee. John's dissertation was to conduct and then digest a survey of gay Latter-day Saint men. And he recruited 1,600, which was a huge size for that time at least, to take this detailed survey. Just before he deployed it, Bill called him and said, John, I want you to add 2 questions. Question number 1, have you ever had a religious experience that has informed your sexuality? Question number 2, if so, what did the Spirit say to you? 60% of the respondents said, yes, I have had a spiritual manifestation informing me. Now, that's 1,000 people within the survey. Of that 1,000, 800, 80% said, the Spirit said, this is who you are and who you will be. Now, what do you do with that? If I were a church leader, I wouldn't turn my back on those 800 people and say, that's bogus. Who am I to say that? I am much more inclined to take them at their word. It's their life, it's their interaction with the Spirit. But it raises the question, okay, then what? And I think the answer to that may be that we have been living under the assumption that we know everything there is to know about afterlife, when in fact we know almost nothing. I will raise this, which seems like a trivial example, but it will shut down the perhaps well-intentioned but off-base people in the church by saying, okay, smarty, if you think you know how much or you know about the afterlife, tell me where we go for Thanksgiving dinner and how many turkeys we have to order. And they realize they don't have a clue. We talk glowingly about, oh, it's an endless chain of children to parents to parents to parents all the way back. What does that look like logistically? Where do they live? What do they do? We don't know. But we have made an assumption, I think, and maybe we just backed into that assumption that we know the details about afterlife, and what we know is there are only men and women and nothing else. And so we have, in effect, reverse engineered what we view in this life and have said, well, since we know that there are only straight men and straight women in the afterlife, that can't be a real state of existence in this life, not an authentic one. So, gee, even if you're biologically imprinted, that doesn't fit with our view of afterlife. And so our only response is, yeah, you'll get fixed when you get resurrected. Does that chain of
Yeah.
logic hold for you?
I love the thought reverse engineer because we've made this assumption. That's super powerful, Greg.
I think it explains where we are. Now, in the aftermath of Boyd Packer's 2010 General Conference address that was so destructive, Dieter Uchtdorf went out and was doing some damage control.
Remind our listeners what he said.
One thing is that he tried from the pulpit extemporaneously to canonize the Proclamation on the Family. And he got swatted down the next day by the First Presidency on that one. But he also said, God would not make you gay. A loving God would not do that. That got taken out of the official version of that talk as well, but it caused an enormous amount of damage. And what President Uchtdorf, then in the First Presidency, said in one of the area meetings was, let's take a deep breath and step back and acknowledge that there's much about the post-mortal existence that we do not understand. That was a great thing to say, to just take a step back and humbly say, we don't know everything. So the subtext there was, let's not hurt each other. And to me, that should be the driving principle.
Wow.
I mean, my theology can be stated in 2 sentences. One is what I heard from Morgan Wooten. You won't know that name. He was a basketball coach in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years. You do know the name John Wooden,
Yes,
who was the
UCLA.
coach at UCLA when I was there. Wooden said of Morgan Wooten, he is the finest basketball coach I know at any level. But Wooten spoke at a community college breakfast that I attended, and he said, you'll never live the perfect day until you help somebody who can never repay you. And I thought, wow, that's good theology. So point number one of my good theology is, if you have the means, help somebody who can't repay you. The second point of my theology is from the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. If you put those two together, that's a pretty good roadmap.
I love that. And, you know, there's a book at Deseret Book called When Church is Hard, written by an anesthesiologist, and you would understand this. He talks about pain is our friend as a doctor because it points to us to things that needs to be addressed, and he uses that analogy to talk in general. I don't think there's an LGBTQ message there, but the principle scales is when people open up about pain at church, that's our friend to understand things that need to be addressed versus shutting them down, or even if we don't feel that pain. I thought it was it's the same point you're making, but it certainly clicked for me thinking it from a doctor perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. We have tended in this church to become exclusive instead of inclusive. We want people to pass a litmus test before we accept them in our community. And I think that's the wrong message. The right message is there should be a flashing sign on every chapel that says, welcome.
Yeah, and I think we need to be explicit. I think we say we love everybody and we talk about belonging, be peacemakers. But there's sort of, this is your chapter 31, which we'll get to, is sort of what's next. That might be our third podcast, is sort of, there's all these things we could do non-doctrinally in the church to improve the experience for queer people, like, just talking to them directly from general conference that they're needed and helping us all to do that. And doctrinal changes that I'm certainly open to that can create the sort of things where there's healing and hope and no pain.
Yeah, and you mentioned the D word, doctrine. That's a stumbling block for a lot of people, including people in the hierarchy, because if something has that label, many people think it's unchangeable. It's set in concrete and you can't fix it. Doctrine just means teaching. And one person's label of doctrine may be another person's label of policy. It's all changeable. And I've made this statement before and have not been challenged on it. I have not seen a single doctrine within the LDS Church of any significance that has gone unchanged since the church was founded.
Give us an example or two. I agree with you. Give us an example or two of someone's hearing that thought for the first time.
I think one of the most dramatic is, all right, what's the nature of God? You look at the Book of Mormon, it's a universalist document that God's going to save everybody. And it doesn't go into really the nature of the deity of the Godhead. If you look at Joseph Smith's first vision, his first vision account, which is 1832, he only talks about the Lord. One. That's consistent with a theology called modalism, where there's one God who can appear in different forms for different purposes. His 1835 account said the Lord, a personage appeared, and then another, like two separate incidents within the same vision. That was at a time when the lectures on faith became the doctrine of a book published in 1835 called Doctrine and Covenants. The doctrine was the lectures on faith. The revelations were the covenants and commandments. And in that lectures on faith, there is a catechism which says in part, how many personages are there in the Godhead? And the answer is 2. The Father is a personage of spirit. The Son is a personage of tabernacle, of flesh. And the Holy Spirit is this collective consciousness, not embodied. Then if you go to the 1838 account, which is the canonized account that's now in the Pearl of Great Price, it has 2 personages appearing simultaneously, looking alike. In fact, an even later account recorded by Orson Pratt said the Father and the Son were identical to each other, which plays off the statement of Jesus, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. So you look at that, that's over a period of only 6 years, that the notion of the Godhead has changed radically from a single individual personage, whatever, that can appear in different forms at different times, to 2 that are not of the same species. One is spirit, one's flesh, to 2 resurrected beings that have a tabernacle of body. That's pretty dramatic evolution, and it takes place in a very short period of time. You could do the same thing with other doctrinal issues, but it all holds up. Everything is flexible and changeable and needs to be. That's where we get off in the wrong direction. We think, well, I know God's unchangeable, therefore we can't have anything that changes. No. We got our training wheels on, and everything should be subject to change because we change and the world changes. And to say we can only do it this way because that's the way we've always done it, that gets you into trouble.
Agreed. It's an ongoing restoration.
It's such a paradox within Mormonism that you could stand up in front of any congregation and say, all of you who accept the principle of continuing revelation, please raise your hand. Every hand in the place would go up. Everybody who's comfortable with change, please raise your hand. And you'd see probably a lot of nervous looks and not many hands going up. Well, how do you have the one without the other? Continuing revelation isn't just saying 9 o'clock and all is well. It means progress. It means change. And part of that change is how we understand and accept our sexual orientation and our gender identities. And there's so much we still don't understand about it. But again, if you go back to point 2 of my theology, do no harm. That's a good place to be.
Great theology. That's probably a good stopping point, but we're only stopping just because we're just doing one episode at a time. Just some closing thoughts. I want to read the dedication of Gregory Prince's book that we're talking about. This is dedicated to the memory of LGBTQ people within the Mormon tradition who suffered and in many instances died for lack of a supportive community, and dedicated to the amazing LGBT people who still consider Mormonism their tribe, and to the hope that their futures will be filled with joy, love, and fulfillment. I also, circling back, I love your simple definition of doctrine. I've heard people try to complicate that with what's a doctrine, what's a policy. I hope everybody heard what Greg said. It's just the teachings. Just a tidbit, how I frame this up, listeners, is there are these eternal truths, like God loves all of his children, men are and women are, they might have joy, love, kindness, compassion, do no harm would be an eternal truth. And then for me, our doctrine, teachings, whatever you want to call it, is an attempt to put that into sort of action within our community. And so I've always wondered, what is the eternal truth? I've wondered if eternal truth is monogamy. And that's sort of tipping my cap a little bit where we might ever get in this space. versus marriages between a man and a woman. Maybe the eternal truth is monogamy. And we can frame it that way and then let people be whatever path they feel is best. But we're a long way from that. I also glad you mentioned Bill Bradshaw. That's maybe one of the reasons I reached out to you, to be honest. You're younger than Bill and in great health. But I wanted to, I was sorry I never had Bill on the podcast. And I saw his obituary and posted it on my social media and wish I had had him on the podcast. Greg Watts and Millie Watts would be another couple I wish I'd had on the podcast. And there's just more people like that. Dwayne Jennings has just released his episode today, one of the early leaders of affirmation. He wrote a couple books called Stumbling Blocks. Those would be about 6 episodes before this one if you want to go back and just listen to someone who's been in the space a long time. What you said about Elder Holland, if you want to know more about that, Elder Holland's feeling about the musket talk, his overall ministry, your episode on Inside Out was terrific. I listened to that. So listeners, if you want to hear more what Greg talks about that, I was fascinated by that. Go to Inside Out, go find that episode and learn more about what Greg talked about with Elder Holland. I loved you. We haven't said trans at all today. We've talked about intersex, but if you're trans or looking for content in that space, chapter 27 in Greg's book is terrific about our trans friends. And we'll talk about that in a subsequent episode. Because as Greg correctly talks, you can't just talk about gay and lesbian people and sort of check the box in this space. I wanted to talk about Levi Martin. That's an intersex young man. He ended up using male pronouns who died by suicide a while ago. We've had his parents on the podcast, and they did everything they could. But that was a very personal story of a family that recognized at some point they did the genetic test that they had intersex kids on their hands, and they did everything they could, but there was really no place for that kid and the difficulty. And one of the things in his suicide note that his parents let me see is, as he was aging up to age 18, I'll read this phrase. I've memorized it. I am terrified at how society treats trans people. And it just takes you into the road of why he felt suicide was, a realistic choice for him, given the complexities. And that's back to your do no harm. And certainly as a society and sometimes within the church, we're doing harm for our trans and intersex friends. So that's all I have to say. Greg, anything you'd like to share in closing?
Well, I look forward to the next installment. We can't do it all in one.
Thanks for your gracious time to do this. I think the next one we'll talk about this long legal history starting with Hawaii. It's fascinating to understand that and the arguments supporting our positions during the day and where we are now and what happened recently. It's kind of shocking to realize where the church was and where the church is on marriage equality, at least in the greater society from a legal perspective. So thanks for listening, listeners. This is Gregory Prince and Richard Osler signing off on another episode of Listen, Learn, and Love.